The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
Glad I did that. Very happy. Right. Well, at least when I learned it, that is.
That dune looks like it would be impossible to climb. Like you'd get maybe 3 steps up and I'd be like, nah, never mind. It looks good from where I'm standing.
Was that with 100% motivation or 0% motivation?
Somewhere in between there, probably closer to like 2 or 3%, because like I said, I'd get 2 or 3 steps in and then give up, like a little baby, like a little dum-dum baby.
Okay, done.
That's mine, by the way, dum-dum baby. Can't
And the
have.
baby? Okay.
You can borrow it, but you can't keep it. I sure demo a lot. Wow.
Messed up.
Apparently I do, right? All this stuff. All these different classes. There we go. Come on, After Effects. Time is money.
Is it?
Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just time. There we go. Disco HUD is back online. Okay. Half res. You don't need the disco track. Let's turn that off. Okay, we're going to get started looking at more little animation tips and tricks and what have yous, I guess. When we left off in our last class, we looked at a lot of different ways that we can populate our interface with elements that give more of that high-tech look that we're trying to get to. We've got some three-dimensional elements that we played around with, right? We've got this cool honeycomb style grid that we put together using grids inside of Illustrator. We're going to step back from just populating our scene with elements, and we're going to look at some of the tools that allow us to build more intricate elements. Now that we've got a handle on shape layers and the overall process of building items for animation, we're going to start to look at how we can hone in on key elements to make our interfaces feel more like something and less like a bunch of cool animated stuff. Like this could almost be anything at this point, even though there's definitely a design thread that we can see. So now we're going to start to specify some of these little elements that we're seeing here. And let's jump into, let's rename this and call it yellow, since that's what that is. Let's jump into our main composition here, this one right here. And if we hit the space bar and let this play, we've got a lot of stuff that's already kind of animating throughout this interface. And most of this is because we're using trim paths and we're offsetting the value using an expression, the time expression, and that's fine. We've got these circular elements that are also animating, okay, and we're using repeater for those different lines. We did that again in a prior class. What I want to do now is start with repeater and get a little more specific. So let's say at the beginning of this animation, okay, and we're going to play with all of these hexes, I think, in a few minutes as well. But at the beginning of this animation, let's have something actually appear, maybe right in the center of this circle here. Maybe this is some sort of a target, let's say, or not sure what we would call it, origin point, possibly, for an interface that we're building. So let's create an object that kind of hones in on this area right here. Let's grab maybe the polygon tool, and let's click and drag a shape. In fact, let's double click and put this right in the center of our composition. So right in the center there is where this is going to land. And let's go into our Polystar path options, and let's change this to 3 points. That looks pretty good. And we can see that our anchor is right in the center, but this is kind of off screen and it's really big. So let's lower the size of this. So outer radius, let's turn that down. Let's take our stroke and get it out of the 82 pixel range and take it down to like maybe 2 pixels. And again, we're going to size this down all the way down, down to like there. So let's go even smaller, maybe that small. Okay. So that looks pretty good. And let's also animate this object. And we've got controls here under Polystar Path. We can animate the way this thing moves. We can animate its rotation. Okay. If I move this and change the rotation, we can see that it's happening to the object from the center of the object. So let's take this and maybe set a keyframe at 0. We'll move this down. And then maybe we'll go to 15 frames for now, and we'll move that there. Now we'll go to 1 second. We want this to be really visible, what we're going to do. So let's just go a full second. So that's going to move like that. Okay? And that's meh right now. That's kind of, okay, it's moving. Let's make that 25. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And it's gray because it's beneath, or I should say above, our tint layer. Let's maybe flip that, put it underneath our tint layer. And let's make this color white so that it's a nice bright blue, the brightest blue we can get. And we'll turn off the highlights so that we can see the actual line. And let's play with these keyframes for a second. I'm going to take these keyframes, I'm going to set them to Easy Ease inside of Graph Editor. So if I select these, okay, and right click, I can choose Easy Ease and we'll see that appear, right? We got this curve. Now we're dealing with position, and there's an X and Y curve here for that reason. I'm going to switch over to Speed Graph so that I can see just one graphic example that I'm going to play around with here. And we know from before that if we adjust these handles, we can adjust the speed at which something moves in between keyframes. So I want this to start and then slow down like that. That looks pretty neat. Okay. Now, let's do something else that's fun. Let's take Polystar here. Let's add a group. Let's put our Polystar into the group, and we'll call this Triangles. And we're calling this Triangles because we're going to click on Triangles. We're going to go under Add, and we're going to choose Repeater. And we're going to add some shapes. Now, Repeater has its own set of controls. We're going to take position and set that to 0 for the X, and then turn up the Y position, right? So if I go like that, now I have 3 of these moving, okay? And that's meh, okay. So what if we set a keyframe on Repeater at 0 and 1 so that we could set our value to 0 and watch these shapes kind of grow into position. That looks pretty cool. Moves kind of funny though. Why do you think it moves kind of funny? We've got one object that we animated using keyframes, and then we duplicated that object twice using repeater. We set keyframes to both the repeater and the original object, and it looks like those things are moving separately. How can we make them look like they're moving together? What should we mimic? There's only one thing to mimic if you think about it. No? All right, well, let's take a look at what Sean's talking about. Let's hit the U key. We've only got 2 sets of keyframes. So what should one set of keyframes do based on the other set of keyframes? Not parent them, mimic them, right? Like, let's take a look at these 2 keyframes here and look at Graph Editor. We're looking at speed graph. See that curve? We made that curve especially for that motion. So if we mimic this curve for that separate element here that we're animating, see how there's no curve, there's no easing on this, right? So let's select these keyframes and ease them. And then let's mimic that same curve, right? Here's the curve for the repeater position, here's the curve for the other position, and they look basically the same. This one can maybe be backed off slightly. That looks pretty close. Now let's check out the animation. Oh. Okay. So that's kind of cool. And all we're doing is mimicking the curves that we're using so that we get the same result no matter what parameters we are adding and also animating. Now, under the transform tools for repeater, we also have start opacity and end opacity. So let's take end opacity and let's play with that. Ooh, that actually makes these kind of fade down a little bit. What about start opacity? Ooh, that takes them all down. That's kind of cool. But I'm going to leave end opacity set to 0 so that these lines look like they're kind of ghosting off from one another. That looks kind of cool. Okay. And I think I'm going to take my polystar path that we animated here. If we take a look at this, we also have controls underneath polystar 1. So I can move this even further. Okay. But I think instead, I'm going to close triangles, I'm going to click on contents, I'm going to go under add, and I'm going to choose repeater again. Okay? And now I've got 3 of those little animations, right? And that's kind of cool. But instead of using position, I'm going to set that to 0. And I'm going to go down to rotation and turn this. Okay? And let's set that to 90 degrees and maybe have 4 copies total. Okay? Now I've got that animation happening.
That's cool.
And that's pretty neat, right? And we're only driving this with a couple of keyframes here and there, right? I can bring those keyframes back if I select my triangle target here. We'll give this a fancy name, fancy-ish name. If I hit the U key, I can bring back the keyframes that I added. And let's say for the beginning position for my initial shape, I'm going to pull that out to maybe here. That looks even more cool. And let's also play around with opacity. Let's just grab opacity for the layer. Let's set keyframes at 0 and 100, or 0 and 1 second, not 100. We want 100% at 1 second. There we go. And then we'll go back to 0 and set that to 0. And then we can take these keyframes and again, ease them and mimic the velocity curve that we used on the prior 2 transforms. Now that looks pretty ornate, right? Now let's go back into our repeaters here. Let's go into triangles, and we've got a repeater here, and then we've got one outside of that right here. If we go into this repeater, and we go back to some of the tools that we have here, we've got all these different layer transforms. Okay, I can play around with scale too. Okay, and I think that looks pretty cool. We take this down to maybe 85%, maybe 80%. Yeah, there we go. I'm liking that. Now let's take this and bring up rotation for the entire layer. And let's maybe set a keyframe at 0 and 1 again. We'll set this value to 180, maybe. And that way this thing kind of spins in like that. That looks pretty cool. We can take these keyframes, ease them, and again, mimic that same curve that we already created a couple of times now. And now we've got that. Okay. And if that's a little quick, all we have to do is select our layer, get out of Graph Editor, hit the U key to bring up our keyframes, and then I can select these values by selecting the keyframes and expand them. Maybe I want this to happen over 2 seconds. That looks better. And then if I go into Graph Editor, I can do the same thing with the handles. I can select, since they're all selected, all the handles at once and kind of manipulate them even further. I like that. Now let's say we want that to happen not right away. Maybe at 1 second we want that to start. So we'll push that layer to 1 second. And let's take a look at our initial color again. We're working with one triangle, right? So if I've got the layer selected, I can change the value of that one triangle. Let's make it maybe a medium gray again. So that kind of makes this a little bit darker. Let's get it darker still. Let's, instead of medium gray, let's make this, yeah, like that. So it comes in and it lands right about at 3 seconds here. That's kind of cool. And let's duplicate the layer. So let's make sure we have the layer selected so that we duplicate the layer, not the shape layer on the layer. And let's take this duplicate and make this pure white. And we'll make this line maybe 1 pixel in thickness. Okay, or we could go 3 pixels. Let's go 3 pixels in thickness. Let's make the one underneath maybe 1 pixel in thickness. There we go. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this layer, the one on top, and we're going to start it right there. So with the layer selected, I'm going to hit the Option and left bracket keys so that this kind of animates in, and then right at that point where it stops, that's when that turns on. That's a little thick. Maybe we'll just go to 2 point. There we go. And let's make this more fun. Let's make this kind of blink on, okay? Now, there's a couple of ways we can do this. We're going to look at several ways to make things blink. Right now, I'm just going to use keyframes, okay? Because I want to show you a special kind of keyframe called a hold keyframe, okay? So I'm going to bring up opacity. And we don't need this keyframe. We can delete it. We can take this keyframe. I'm going to reset it to being a linear keyframe. And I can do that by right-clicking and going under keyframe interpolation and playing with this value and setting it to linear. Okay. I can also command-click the keyframe, and that'll cycle it through various types of keyframes, getting it back to linear. And I'm going to right-click again and choose Hold Keyframe. Hold keyframes are like light switches, on-off light switches, okay, not the ones with a dimmer. So like these switches for the lamps or the switches for the overheads, one way is on, the other way is off. Okay? So hold keyframes allow us to work with no tweening, no interpolation. Okay, so I'm going to go maybe 2 frames forward, click on opacity and type 0. And then 2 frames forward, I'm going to type 100. And then 2 frames forward, and I'll copy these last 2 keyframes, paste them down the timeline. And then I'll go 2 frames forward from the last one, and I'll copy all of these and paste them down the timeline. And that gives me that kind of blinky, I'm turning on look, right? That's animating in, and then boop. That looks pretty good. And if I wanted to condense this, which I do, I can just grab these keyframes and push them together. I can do this in a couple of ways. I can move them individually, or I can hold down Option and move them like this. Okay? The only thing I have to be careful of is to make sure that I don't place these values in between frames, which you can see I kind of did for at least a few of them. Right? You can kind of see the frame breaks. Right? That's what these lines are, these gray lines. So I'm going to grab all of these and extend them out like so. That looks cool. Now it looks like it's turning on, like lands and boom. You can almost hear the sound effect, right? Boom. So that's pretty neat, but that's really not using expressions like we were talking about. That's repeater. Repeater's one of those tools that we wanted to play with. If we look at this inside of our demo, we can kind of see these elements kind of animating together, and that looks neat. Right? But we can do better than that, right? Let's go back into our composition, and let's think about ways to really kind of spice this whole thing up a little bit. And right now we've got a lot of random movement, a lot of lines that just kind of shoot all over the place, following a rail, a path, okay? So let's start with that idea. Let's grab the pen tool, make sure we have no layers selected, and let's click and add some shapes here. Let's maybe click here. Let's try that again. Click here. Oh, I turned this off. There we go. Hold down Shift, we'll click right there. Maybe we'll come down here. We'll zoom in, maybe this way. We'll click here, we'll hold down Shift and click there. Maybe we'll pop out going down this way. Let's back up a little bit. And maybe this line just kind of animates to that point right there. That might be perfect. Now let's grab these points. Maybe shift them up slightly so they align with this horizontal that we can see kind of running through right about there. And this looks pretty parallel to this edge, and that's what we want, so that looks good. At this point, we could click that and maybe pull it this way. At this point, we could pull this way. Okay, so we've got this line. Let's put this under our tint. We can turn this back off. And let's do what we've done already. Let's grab this line and play around with some of our different functions that we can use here. We do have a round corners function. This might, yep, there it is. Gives us that round edge. I was going to say this might not work. Some shapes, when they're not closed, it doesn't want to work on, but that actually is working pretty good. And that gives us that nice little corner edge element that looks like everything else in how we've kind of already conceived this little UI. I'm going to click on path 1 because I think I want to grab this point and pull it maybe to the middle, right there. So that's looking pretty good so far. We're going to take trim paths, we're going to add that to this. I'm going to put this, I should have to put this before round corners, so I'm just going to do that. Then we're going to take this and just kind of pick a value like maybe 80% of the line is gone. And we can see that like so. There's the line right there. And let's animate the offset, but let's do this. We'll set a keyframe. We'll go to maybe 3 seconds. Let's animate this all the way up to the point where this whole thing oscillates once. So let's just do this. We'll set 1 revolution. And that should make the line go all the way through once. Yep, there we go. And then end up where it started. And that's good. Because when we deal with looping, we need things to end kind of where they start to make them look like they're looping seamlessly. Because we're going to loop this. Okay? Now, to get this to loop, let's save, and I think we're going to need to do this. To get things to loop, we have to work a little bit harder. We have to add an expression. Okay? The expression we're going to add is the loop out expression. And we can get to that fairly easily by simply option clicking in this area right here. Okay, right on that stopwatch. And this is for the offset where we have keyframes already. And then I've got another behavior panel. I'm going to go under here, and I want to go to Property and choose Loop Out. Okay. Now when I add this, let's take a look at what that line now does. We'll turn our background back on. Just continuously loops. So we didn't have to set a bunch of keyframes. Here's the best part about it. I think this should go faster. Okay. I think this should go slower. Okay. All we have to do is move one of those 2 keyframes and we can get that to go faster or slower. I'm going to grab this and pull this down here. We can even get it to start at a specific time where those keyframes begin. But I'm going to want this to continuously animate, so I'll put that there. And I'll set this back to maybe 3. And that's just by adding 2 keyframes and then making sure that the elements can loop because they are the same at the beginning and the end of the loop cycle. And then we're adding loop out using expressions. So that's kind of cool. We didn't really have to do that much to get that. Now we can click on this line, our path. We can edit the stroke. I think I like the stroke thickness, so I'm going to keep that. And let's go underneath stroke and set this to round cap. And let's call this thin animated line. And then we already have this. Let's duplicate it. And we'll call the duplicate something clever, like thick animated line. And let's make this about a little over double the thickness. It's already all automated, right? So we can just come in here, go to Trim Paths, set this to maybe 95. And then what if we changed the offset on this, right? What if we first sped this up, maybe at 1.5 seconds this thing loops. So 1 second, 15 frames. All right, so that looks pretty good. And then we could even change the offset value that it starts on by changing our number. And let's maybe turn this up a little bit more. I think I want to take down the shape just a little bit. Make it maybe 97. There we go. So now when this starts, we have all that stuff kind of occurring all at once. Okay? That's looking pretty good. Now, we've got a lot of layers that we still haven't really played around with in this project, but I'm going to skip animating all of those pieces. I'm just going to go to dark lines here. And I'm going to bring up scale. And I'm going to mimic what we did earlier. We set keyframes at 0 and 1 second on the timeline. Let's ease them. Take this first one, set this to maybe 25. And then let's grab these keyframes. We'll go in here. We'll select our handles. And we'll start to adjust them. So now that scale up happens and it looks pretty good. And let's take that scale we'll hit the U key. We'll copy those keyframes. Looks like these elements right here are the ones that kind of fit in with our dark lines. So we've got those keyframes copied. Let's unlock these layers. Let's click on this one. No. Maybe that one. One up top here. We'll click on this one. We'll bring up scale. Let's go to maybe 15 frames and paste that there. Okay. That might not be, might be too far. Let's go maybe 10 frames. Maybe a lot shorter. Maybe we'll go 4 frames. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So let's take these keyframes, let's copy them, but let's take all of these layers, except for dark lines, and let's parent them to this. So we're just going to parent them there, and now they'll all kind of transform. There we go. That looks pretty neat. And all we did was offset the animation by having that one part happen slightly later. Just 4 frames later. Okay? And then probably maybe at 8 frames, that's where we should animate maybe our circle pieces here. So let's parent circle 2 to circle. We can select this and just paste in our scale keyframes. There we go. And maybe our line animation doesn't start until everything lands. So maybe right at 1 is is where we want the thick and thin lines to start animating. Now, what if we had maybe a series of little grid elements, okay, that were supposed to animate like graphs, like little bar graphs, okay? Let's maybe set up some bar graphs. So let's grab another shape layer, maybe the rectangle tool. We'll draw this right here. We're going to go into the rectangle path. We're going to play with the size of this. Let's also get rid of stroke and add a fill. Make this white for now. Okay. We'll unlock size. We'll make it 15 pixels wide by 100 pixels tall. 200 pixels tall. There we go. You can always scale this down. Now we've got a size, okay, but we also have scale, okay. So underneath rectangle 1, right, here's rectangle 1, we've got a scale value we can play with, okay. I'm going to take my anchor point, I'm going to zoom in here, okay. We can see the scale value change. I'm going to take my anchor point. We're going to use a guide to set this up. So I'm going to bring up guides. And I'm going to move this object with the anchor point value so that the base and the anchor point are in the same place for this rectangle. Okay. Then if I animate scale, it's kind of animating from right there, right? And if I unlock scale and just animate the Y value, now the bar goes up and down. That's kind of cool. Okay. But I want that to happen on its own. I don't want to have to worry about controlling that. Okay. So let's solo this layer for a second and put it right front and center. Let's get rid of the guides for a minute. We don't need those anymore. There we go. So I want this to animate so that it kind of just goes up and down on its own. I could set keyframes for scale now, right? I could even loop them. We saw how to use loop out. That actually would make a lot of sense. We could set those keyframes, and then after I set several, I could just choose loop out, and we continue to do that again, and that would work. I'm going to show you another method that's, I'm not going to say better, but probably a little bit better, because it's automated, okay? But it's going to require more expressions. So we're going to option click, and we're going to add an expression in here, okay? So let's do that. We're going to add the letter X. Actually, let's make it Y. We're going to add the letter Y, and then equals. Then we're going to type random. Let's put in a number. Let's put in 8. Okay. Then we're going to add a semicolon. And we're going to go down to the next line. Okay. Then we're going to type, this is where it gets a little confusing. I'm going to type a bracket, the word value, then another bracket with a 0, and then a bracket that closes that, and then a comma, then the letter Y, and we're going to go like that. And now we've got something that's jumping around. Let's make this number larger. Let's make it 50. Okay. Let's make this number larger still. Let's make it 100. Let's make it its original size. Okay. Now we went from adding one little line of code in the form of a word and a math symbol, the multiplier, and then a number, to another type of code writing, Okay, and that is where we can create and define variables. Okay, this y is a letter I picked at random. Okay, any letter outside of quotes will do. Okay, so let's try Dum Dum Baby. Let's put that there, and does it still work? Well, look at that, it still works. Because any set of letters that we put together, any alphanumerics, we can use as what's called a variable. By default, After Effects sees letters that it doesn't already know as a function or something else as a variable. Okay, so I'm going to make a variable, and a variable is nothing more than a container. It's going to hold something. So the variable Dum Dum Baby equals something, and that's how I put something into my container. I say container equals, and then the thing that goes in the container, and then I've got a filled container. Does that make sense? So whatever words I want to use, as long as there's no spaces, Dum Dum Baby equals, and then we have a little expression function called random. Okay? The random function will allow you to take any value and get it to change based on the number that you put in parentheses. So what are we changing? We're changing scale, right? And scale goes basically from 0 to 100. It goes beyond that as well, but to get to the actual size of the object, you would go from 0 to 100, right? So if I put 100 in those parentheses, that means from 0 to 100, the value for each frame will be a random number between 0 and 100. Okay, so frame 1 it's 5, frame 2 it's 52, frame 3 it's 67, frame 4 it's 6. Okay, and just randomly from 1 to 100, a number is generated, and then because of the equal sign, that number gets put into Dum Dum Baby. Okay, and After Effects says, okay, these numbers are going into Dum Dum Baby. I don't know why yet, and that's why I have to end this line just like we would end a sentence. Okay, because that's one sentence or one line of code. To end any line of code, and we're going to talk about code a lot, so don't worry, or be very afraid, depending on how you want to look at that. I'm not going to expect you to remember what I'm saying right now just based on this one time that I'm saying it, I guess is what I'm getting at. Okay, but at the end of any line of code, we have to add a semicolon when we want to go to a new line. So that's our version of a period, let's say, to end a sentence. And then return, and we finish. Okay, the actual math, or I guess code that's happening, happens here. Okay, scale is two values. One value is 100%, and it's staying that way. That's the width. We don't want that to change. The second value is the one we want to go up and down, right? Because the second value makes the bar look like it's moving up and down, even though it's just changing scale. Does that make sense? So if we were to take these two numbers and write them in code, we'd make an opening bracket, we'd write the number 100, we'd put a comma, we'd write the number 100 again, and we'd make a closing bracket. And that would be what we see right here, X and Y. Okay? So to write that in code, I could put the number 100 in here. And this would work absolutely the same way, because the X value would stay at 100. The Y value would be whatever this variable says it should be based on that little bit of function code. Okay, the random function. So why did I put in value 0? Any guesses? Because Sean knows code and he wants to show off because he's a dumb baby. Wouldn't be wrong necessarily, although I'm not trying to show off. The reason why is this simple. Because I didn't put in the number 100 for that X value, and I put in instead code that means put in whatever number you want over there in the interface, because that's what value and then 0 in brackets means. It really means take whatever the X value is and use that. Okay, now I can take this whole thing, Let's set this back to 100. I've got a customizable element now. I can take this, duplicate it, okay, rectangle 2. I can move the position of it, put it right there, and now these two things animate separately. Okay, I can take rectangle 3, duplicate it. How far did I move this one over? It looks like I moved it 23. Let's pick a even number like 25, although 25 is not an even number, but a value that's easily duplicated, let's say. And let's go to 50, right? And then let's duplicate this again. And let's go to 75. Okay, and let's duplicate this again. And let's go to 100. Okay. And then let's grab this scale value and change this to 50. Okay. Now in doing that, I'm going to have to push this back over. Okay, but now I've got a slightly different looking bar graph, right? So we'll push this to like maybe -90. There we go. That way it looks like we have the same spacing. And then let's grab rectangle 5. We'll duplicate that. We'll go back into transform. Let's make this 25 this time. Then we'll push that over to there. Okay. And I'm just doing this part to show you that you can have varying thicknesses now. I can go back into any of these other rectangles, like rectangle 3. What a great rectangle 3 was. We can change the size on that one, and then just use anchor point to push that back into position. Maybe we want it right there. Okay, just based on that one little bit of code, now we've got this. Okay? And I can go back into these. Let's go to 4. And again, I can go back into transform. We did this earlier. Let's change 4 to maybe 75% opacity. 5, let's change this to 50. And 6, maybe we'll change that to 25. That looks pretty good. Now, the one thing you might notice is this base is a little bit shaky because we didn't exactly get that anchor point right at the base of our first shape. Okay? So how are we going to fix that? I'm going to grab animated bars. I'm going to select it. I'm going to come up here. I'm going to grab the rectangle tool. And then I'm going to click on Tool Creates Mask. That allows me to draw a mask right over the top of this. And I want this mask to cut off the base where that twitchiness is because we didn't quite line up that anchor point properly. And now it looks perfect at the base. And we've got this nifty little animated bar that we can put wherever we want. All right, maybe we grab this and put it over here in our interface. If we select this and grab our anchor point, we can place that right at the base of any one of these shapes, and then just use scale to take the size of this down a little bit more if we think that that whole thing is a little too big. Then we can put it in various places, like maybe that one goes there. That looks pretty good. Or maybe I take this and duplicate it again. And because I moved the anchor point, I can grab rotation and set this to 90. All right, maybe I've got a series of bars that animate like this. Then I can duplicate this one, drag this over here, bring up scale. Oops, wrong one. Flip it by making that a negative value, right? So now that flips that way, and you should probably flip both of these, right? Yeah. Right? No, that looks good. We'll just back this up. You're right there. Okay. So now we're starting to get a lot of little animated things that are occurring. That's kind of cool. We're running out of time, but let's add one more element. Let's take a look. We've been playing around with shape layers and little bits of code to give us all this fun stuff. I'm going to maybe take both of these because I am just not going to rest until these make sense. No. Let's delete that one. Maybe we'll take this one. Ooh, I know. We'll rotate it all the way around. There we go. And we'll pull that one down here. Okay, that's better. That hurts my face more. Less. Hurts my face less. There we go. Yeah, so that looks pretty good. But let's add a solid. We'll make this black. And we'll call this spectrum. And we're going to go up to effect. And we're going to look for, it should be under simulation. Well, it might be under sound. Generate. There it is. Audio waveform and audio spectrum. Let's try audio spectrum first. Okay, and this gives us a line based on audio. Now here's where you have to have extra stuff. Okay, we're going to have an audio track. So I'm going to grab my drive just to show you how this works. But any audio will do because we're not going to actually play the audio. Okay, so I'm going to import an audio file. So I'm going to need this to do that. Let me plug this in real quick and I'll find an audio file. Music works really good for this, by the way. If you have any MP3s of any kind, let's go into backup, let's go into music. Zelda. Let's do something like, it doesn't matter. Let's grab any track. It's going to start with music. That might work. Let's just grab this, drag it to the desktop. And then we're going to import that sound. Okay? So that sound is inside of After Effects. It's also on our timeline because I dragged it in here. I don't want to hear it per se, okay, but I'm going to have to leave that on temporarily, and you'll see why. We're going to take these two layers, we're going to pre-comp them, and we're going to call this spectrum. Then let's go into our pre-comp. I'm going to select this layer and hit the L key twice, because that allows me to see my audio waveform, okay? And thankfully, it does kind of start right away, this track that I chose. So I'm going to select my effect, and I'm going to choose the track that we're using for source, which is track 10 here, okay? And you can already see what's starting to happen, right? See how those lines are starting to move here? A little bit here and there, okay? And I can play around with where the frequency happens, okay? I can play around with the maximum height, so I can crank this up, okay? Audio duration I can play around with. There's a bunch of stuff here. I can change the overall thickness of this. Inside and outside color I can play with. I think I'm going to make the inside color white and the outside color a medium gray. Something like that, okay? And then let's just let this play for a second. Right. Of course, we have to hear the goofy music that I absolutely adore. Not ashamed to say it. Okay. But more importantly, if we can, forget about the music for a second, we've got this totally random animated element that we can play around with in a whole bunch of different ways. But for now, we're going to take this and let's turn down the thickness again. And we can move these points together a little bit. So if I grab the end point, I can kind of push this together a little bit. I can turn that down if that's too much. Okay. That's looking pretty cool. And now that I have this, let's look at how we can manipulate this. Path, none, right? So let's grab the ellipse tool. Let's double click and add a mask to this. Let's turn this down, maybe make it look like a circle, or we could draw a circle. Then I can choose mask 1.
Right, that's cool.
It is pretty cool, right? And use polar path, that's something else we'll talk about later. But let's just set this back to none, and we'll get rid of the mask for now, because I'm going to take this line. If I go back into demo, I'm going to turn off the sound, which is why we pre-comped it, because with the sound off, the spectrum doesn't work, right? So it's inside a composition where that's working. We can take that, drop it underneath our tint, grab scale, turn this down, place this somewhere. Maybe we want to rotate this. Have this happen like off to the side. So here's this cool thing that's animating. Right? Maybe we put this here. And then, ooh, let's draw a box. We'll put a box around it. That always looks fancy. Fancy box time. We'll make that a 1 pixel thickness. We're going to zoom in a little bit. Now we're going to want to balance this, so I'm going to grab shape layer 1 and just make sure that it's kind of aligned with the object here. That looks pretty good. And then I can go under rectangle, rectangle path, around the corners. And I'm sure you can kind of take it from there, right? All the things that we can start to do. If we parent this to shape layer 1 or shape layer 1 to this, now we can move that around a little bit more, kind of align it more. Maybe it's aligned right here. Maybe it's just a little element, right? Maybe it's just this little thing, because it took us next to nothing to get that. And then we can put that right there. or even parent it to the stuff that we've already generated that's animated. I can come in here, turn up the thickness of my line if I think that's a little too small at that new size. And then if we go back into our main composition and start to look at how some of this stuff is animating, we've got lots of stuff in here now. This is like littered. Let's turn off those for a minute, just so that we can see some of the animated elements that are already here, right? We'll leave that. So obviously our three-dimensional box that we looked at before, we'd want to change the size of that or even pop it out of there. We may not need it anymore. But you can see how very quickly this starts to really get involved with just some of the simple tools that we have to play around with right inside of After Effects. You know, again, I'm thinking about taking this spectrum and just turning it up. Or maybe just pulling it all the way over here. That's a little too far. But because these elements are pre-comped, we can kind of move them around and adjust them. We're going to talk more about pre-comping later. We didn't quite get to that today. But we will. I might even take these elements and put them outside that shape. They stand out a little bit more that way. That way I can color them separately if I need to. The one thing I do want to call out before we stop is one more feature regarding color. I'm going to go under Effects and Presets. And again, we've got all this stuff that we're kind of demoing. And there's little things that I would change, like, you know, these should animate in, obviously, and there's details in there we could play around with. But I'm going to forego all that and type CC Toner. Okay, because I wanted to bring up color again. We used tint to set our colors, and that worked pretty well. But then we started playing around with different values of gray. Okay? CC Toner, which is another effect, allows us to give a third color to the values between white and black. Okay, so gray would be a separate color than white and black. So we'll keep black a blue black, like a real dark blue black. We'll make our highlights this same color up here, so let's sample that. But then this color, we'll sample that blue, but we're going to warm it up, right, and make it a little bit darker. Okay, so again, I'm only using one effect. I'm using CC Toner, and I'm getting two separate colors into my interface based on their lightness. Okay, and I can grab this blue and maybe saturate it up a little bit. Make it a little more blue even. To make sure that the separation shows up. And then again, if I go in here, that really kind of pops the color a little bit more. And I can probably turn off that second glow, or turn it down at least. Let's select that second glow. Maybe turn up the threshold, the radius, and take this to from add to screen maybe. There we go. Got rid of that heat that was on there. Okay. So again, doesn't take a lot once you start playing with the tools and they start to make sense. Okay, 'cause it's going to take a little bit of time to kind of wrap your heads around what needs to be done process-wise in order to get the keyframes where you want them, to get stuff to animate the way that you want them to. And I'm going to turn off some of this stuff, because this is feeling like ice cream pizza a little bit. Got so many things happening here. Yeah, that's a little better. All right, now we can see the better kind of the fruits of our labor from earlier, right? We can start to see all these elements. Okay? All right, so this is a good place to stop it, I think. We'll stop recording. And this will also be available for you guys to watch really soon as it's done rendering and uploading, which I'm going to start that process right now. So don't be afraid to play with color like we're seeing here. Just when you do, think about color as a design element, right? More is not necessarily better. Like we've got 3 distinct color values that do go together fairly well, and yet it is starting to feel a little bit like a Crayola crayon box vomited up on the screen a little bit. Okay, I would definitely probably, pick another color for that salmon color that's either more blue or more yellow. But you get the idea. Probably don't need those. That. Throw the music back on.
Good luck with today's lesson.